Happy Days was meant to close out with a heartfelt send-off that gave fans real closure. Instead, something went sideways. Episodes resurfaced out of order. Timelines stopped making sense. And the ending everyone remembered suddenly wasn't a real ending anymore. Here's what actually happened behind the scenes, and a few other surprising facts about the show along the way. Backslash by the late 1970s, Ron Howard, who played Richie Cunningham, wasn't simply going along with every network decision anymore. A quiet conflict had been building, and it centered on a change that looked minor from the outside, but mattered enormously to the people involved. By its third season, Happy Days had become a genuine phenomenon. Ratings were strong, and the cast had become household names. But the real breakout wasn't Richie. It was Fonzie. Henry Winkler's leather-jacketed, effortlessly cool character had taken off in a way nobody fully anticipated, and the network noticed. ABC's idea was to capitalize on that popularity by renaming the series entirely around Fonzie. To the network, it looked like smart branding. To Howard, it felt like an attack on the show's foundation. Richie had been the emotional anchor of the series since episode 1, and renaming the show meant redefining what it was. When the proposal landed in a meeting with creator Gary Marshall and network executives, Howard didn't hedge. He said plainly that he'd walk if the title changed. He was 21 years old, and he wasn't negotiating. His reasoning was that the show worked precisely because of its ensemble balance. Fonzie's appeal landed harder because of the world around him, not instead of it. What made the standoff even more notable was Henry Winkler's response. Even though the proposed change would have centered the show squarely on his character, Winkler backed Howard, arguing the show's strength came from the whole cast rather than any single role. With both actors aligned, ABC backed off and the title stayed put. But the disagreement left a mark. It exposed a real divide between the show's creative leadership and the network's business instincts. For Howard, it became a turning point that nudged him toward thinking about a future beyond acting. For the series, it was an early sign that bigger tensions were still ahead. In early 1984, ABC was gearing up for what looked like a ratings win. Exclusive coverage of the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo. But the scheduling fallout from that broadcast quietly created problems for one of the network's longest-running hits. The Olympics took over prime-time slots throughout February, bumping regular programming, including Happy Days, then in its 11th and final season. Several episodes meant to lead into the series' finale got pushed back, leaving ABC with a choice: delay the finale itself or air it as planned and deal with the displaced episodes later. ABC chose to keep the finale on schedule. On May 8, 1984, the show aired its last episode, Passages, an emotional, well-received send-off that gave viewers a genuine sense of closure. But that wasn't actually the end. Once Olympic coverage wrapped, ABC still had those delayed episodes sitting unused. Rather than scrapping them, the network aired them between June and July, weeks after the official finale had already aired. To viewers, it was bewildering. Characters who'd already said goodbye were suddenly back. Storylines picked up as if nothing had concluded, and the emotional weight of the finale started to feel undercut. The issue wasn't really about scheduling logistics. It was about trust. A series finale functions as an implicit promise that the story is over. By resuming the show afterward, ABC broke that promise, turning what viewers experienced as bonus content into something closer to a disruption. The episode became something of a cautionary tale across the industry, reportedly contributing to networks adopting stricter practices for protecting finales from being followed by leftover, unaired material. Before he became one of television's most iconic faces, Henry Winkler was simply trying to get by. He arrived in Hollywood in 1973 with barely enough money to last a month, after years of inconsistent, poorly paid theater work in New York. He wasn't chasing stardom at that point. He just needed a job. That context makes his audition for Happy Days more interesting. The actor who'd go on to play the ultra-confident Fonzie was, in reality, nervous and unsure of himself walking in. The role wasn't even written as a major part, just a small supporting character. Somehow, Winkler made it stand out anyway. By the show's third season, Fonzie had become the center of gravity for the entire series. The jacket, the catchphrases, the quiet swagger, it all turned Winkler into a cultural fixture almost overnight. Merchandise sold briskly. Kids imitated his style, and Winkler went from unknown actor to one of the most recognizable people on American television in a remarkably short time. That kind of success came with real costs, though. Winkler became so identified with Fonzie that separating the actor from the character became difficult for casting directors and audiences alike. When the show ended in 1984, that identity essentially vanished overnight, and Winkler has described the experience as something close to losing part himself. It wasn't just a matter of finding new acting work. It was about figuring out who he was without the role that had defined over a decade of his life. Typecasting made the transition harder, and despite his fame, he found himself wrestling with the same uncertainty and self-doubt he'd felt as a broke young actor arriving in California. Rather than give up, Winkler moved behind the camera, directing television projects, including episodes of MacGyver and Night Shift. He rebuilt his career gradually, taking on roles that showcased range beyond Fonzie. Decades later, his performance in Barry finally brought him the kind of recognition many felt was overdue, including an Emmy win in 2018. Even with that late career vindication, Winkler has spoken candidly about how difficult those in-between years were. Success, in his case, left some real emotional scars even as the public continued to see him as a leather-jacketed icon. By 1984, Happy Days wasn't just a sitcom anymore. It had become part of millions of viewers' weekly routines, offering warmth and familiarity for over a decade. So when it came time to end the series, creator Gary Marshall wanted something that felt personal rather than perfunctory. ABC nearly didn't let him do it. Marshall's plan was for Tom Bosley's character, Howard Cunningham, to look directly into the camera and speak to the audience, breaking the fourth wall in a way that was almost unheard of on television at the time. The medium relied on the illusion that viewers were passive observers. Characters simply didn't acknowledge them. ABC executives worried the moment would undercut the realism the show had built over more than 10 years. Marshall disagreed. He saw Happy Days as something the audience had lived alongside for over a decade, and felt viewers deserved to be acknowledged as part of that journey rather than kept at arm's length. After considerable back and forth, the network relented. When Passages aired on May 8, 1984, the moment happened exactly as Marshall envisioned. Bosley, as Howard Cunningham, turned the camera and thanked the audience directly for being part of the family. It was understated and sincere, and rather than breaking the show's illusion, it deepened it. Viewers didn't feel pulled out of the story. They felt folded into it. The reaction was strong, with many fans moved to tears, and the scene became one of the more memorable sign-offs in television history. The very risk ABC had resisted ended up defining the finale's legacy. That legacy, unfortunately, didn't stay intact for long. The leftover episode rollout that followed weeks later undid much of what that single scene had accomplished. What should have been a clean, well-earned farewell didn't stay that way. Weeks after Passages aired in May 1984, ABC brought the show back with 5 previously unaired episodes, material that had simply been bumped earlier in the year by Olympic coverage, not new story content meant to extend the series. Rather than shelving the episodes quietly, ABC released them between June and September with little context. The first aired June 4th. Taken on its own, it played as a fairly ordinary, lightweight sitcom episode, but coming after such a deliberately emotional finale, it felt jarring and out of place. Audiences had already gotten their goodbye. Now characters were back as though nothing had happened. Each additional episode added to the disorientation. The story had technically already concluded, yet here it was continuing anyway, and emotional resonance of the finale began to erode. The contrast was stark. Passages had tied together themes of family and growth into something that felt complete. The leftover episodes blurred that sense of finality instead. By the time the last of them aired in September, the damage to the show's send-off was done. Happy Days didn't lose its overall legacy, but it did lose the clean emotional ending it had earned, a reminder that knowing when to stop matters just as much as the story itself. Despite the messy conclusion, the cast's individual paths afterward varied widely. Ron Howard had already been easing toward directing before the show ended, and he moved into it fully afterward, eventually helming films like Apollo 13 and A Beautiful Mind. The finale controversy barely touched his trajectory. If anything, it reinforced his pull toward creative control over his own projects. Henry Winkler's path was rockier. Fonzie made him famous, but also boxed him in for years, and his career slowed before picking back up in the 1990s with roles in Scream and The Waterboy, eventually building to the acclaim he found with Barry. He's since suggested that the show's ending never quite felt complete to him. Marion Ross kept working steadily, with credits including Gilmore Girls and voice work on SpongeBob SquarePants, and remained, for many fans, the emotional center of the Cunningham family. Tom Bosley also moved easily into other roles, though he remained closely associated with Howard Cunningham. His direct address finale moment became one of the show's most quoted scenes. When he passed away in 2010, fans remembered him as something close to a familiar father figure rather than just an actor. Not everyone's post-show years were as smooth. Erin Moran, who played Joni, dealt with typecasting and financial hardship. Her spin-off was short-lived, and her later years were difficult before her death in 2017. Scott Baio, who played Chachi, continued acting but became better known in later years for his public commentary than his television work. Anson Williams stepped away from acting into business ventures, while Don Most shifted his focus toward music. Each cast member, in their own way, had to redefine themselves once the show ended. For the cast and for fans, the finale left two competing memories: the genuinely moving farewell everyone connected with, and the leftover episode that muddied it afterward. Years later, public reunions between Ron Howard and Henry Winkler reminded audiences of what made the show resonate in the first place. And for many, those reunions finally delivered something closer to the ending the series had always deserved.